Hello everyone. Today we will talk about the separation of the military profession and politics in German military history. And for this we have a guest, Professor Neitzel from the University of Potsdam, who has a new book out, Deutsche Krieger, German Warriors, which looks at German military history and especially as soldiers from 1871 to 2020. Welcome, Professor Neitzel.
Hello everyone.
I had the pleasure to read a pre-release of your book, and what I noticed and found particularly interesting is that you mentioned for the Bundeswehr, for the Western German armed forces, that there was also this, at one point, the separation between the military profession and politics. Now I'm very aware that this is usually brought up with the Wehrmacht in some ways as an excuse, but also pre-war mentions. So what is the general aspect here that this comes again up in the Bundeswehr? Or is this generally also before the Wehrmacht a common thing among German forces?
Yeah, from a German perspective, what is new is that soldiers are guided by their social daily business. And the social daily business of soldiers is prepare to fight or then do the fighting. And from that regard, I think that the military is also very much concentrated on their skills, on their plan a war and the fight a war. And on the especially on the grassroots level, it has very little to do with politics. Of course, they are all citizens of a given state, and in the German case, in the Bundeswehr then of the Federal Republic of Germany, which was a very different state to Nazi Germany or Imperial Germany. But so in this regard, the soldiers are citizens of different states and they have different political backgrounds. But this is so a discontinuity. But there's a continuity very much in how they perceived their military job and how they were concentrated on the currency of the military, being efficient, being brave. And this kind of things. So therefore I would think the logic of how soldiers and officers perceive themselves as military professionals is not that different in over 150 years of German history.
For other armed forces, is there any particularly known where there's a major difference here, that they are more political or something, or basically it's a general attribute they are focused on the skill level?
I mean, this is a big debate, for example, for the Red Army. How communist was the Red Army in the Second World War, ? Or how, I don't know, political are different armies in different periods and different times. And there's a big debate on the Red Army, and we have two little documents to answer that. I would make the point that, of course, there are different levels, different frames of reference. I would call it frames of reference. And of course, there's always a political frame of reference. And of course, these soldiers are part of a society, are part of a state. So they are not single independents somehow. So they grew up somewhere, they went to school, they read newspapers, etc. So we can't distinguish that. We can't neglect that. So there is a political attitude. But on the how important is that? And I think it's important possibly for staff officers, etc. But if you go to the normal ranks and the NCOs, I think the skills and the professionalism is much more important. And of course, every state wants that their soldiers fighting for the Kaiser, for the king, for the Tsar, for the Führer, for the constitution or whatever. But at least on the German example, I could show in my book that all these states to a degree failed. So in Imperial Germany, the soldiers were not as king-loving or emperor-loving as they wanted to have them. The same was, the Wehrmacht was, yes, on the higher levels and also sometimes on the soldier level, people believed in Nazi ideology, but not to that degree that Hitler wanted it. So therefore, this is the reason why Hitler expanded the Waffen-SS, because the Wehrmacht was, in his regard, not Nazi enough. And the same is the case in the Bundeswehr. The Bundeswehr, they thought, the their wish for fighting and their motivation must come from the German constitution. They must fighting for the constitution. But this is by far too theoretical. And possibly the staff officers in a specific age, in a specific rank, they have invested in the institution. They were fighting for the political system, but not the private first class. They normally have their job to do, their job they fulfill, the primary groups, the core groups, the military profession. They want to be a good tank driver, a good tank commander, more or less full stop.
So I personally have my own thesis on this whole aspect. If I look at this, you mention in your book the trinity of fighting, killing, dying. So this is a very primal and very on the survival level. And so I look a bit at biology, and basically every organism is basically meant to be as efficient and energy saving as possible. So for a soldier who is out there to kill and to survive, it's basically everything, okay, everything is focused on that, on the fighting part, on being efficient and effective. And as such, it makes to a certain degree sense to completely shut out politics. Actually, from that aspect, it shouldn't be so surprising, but it seems like in some cases that people, especially politicians or policymakers, are sometimes like confused. I think you mentioned it as sometimes, okay, the soldiers again don't care about politics.
I mean, yeah, you could make the argument that it shouldn't come as a surprise. And even people who, I mean, I would call it the impact of the situation, which you described as, fighting, killing and dying. The impact of the situation can be discussed among sociologists in a different way. But I would rank the situation very, very high. I mean, there are different impact factors there. Politics, there's society, public opinion, what kind of task is it? Is it a just war or not a just war? Etc., etc., etc. But the situation of the fighting, I think, is the impact is so huge. And the identities, to a degree, are melting somehow. And we have examples in the German case, like Willy Peter Reese, who was a private first class and then an NCO on the Eastern Front. And he was a writer. He was a poet. He was totally anti-Nazi, etc. But even in his writings and poets, you could see how he adopted to the situation of the fighting. That first of all, he wanted to be a good comrade. He don't wanted to be a coward. He didn't really understand what the Germans were doing in Russia, but he don't want to be a coward, he wanted to be a brave soldier. And yeah, he did the best he could do to survive. And there was very little reflection in his enormous amount of papers on politics. Although he was anti-Nazi, this was very clear, but very, very little. And if you compare that with diaries I could look at of German soldiers in Afghanistan in 2010, 2009, again, it's surprisingly little on a larger political stuff. Very little. Well, of course, there's nothing on the German constitution, there's nothing of the blah blah of the German parliament or anything else. It's very much the task. It's about the comrades, it's about surviving. Yeah, very little. Even if these soldiers are, staff soldiers, they studied, sometimes they have even a PhD, and they are driven not only, but very much by the situation of the fighting and the job they have to fulfill.
So I don't have anything to add. Do you have anything to add here?
Well, possibly as one point. I mean, the interesting thing is that if we discuss among historians and sociologists the motivation of a given soldier, then the impact factors are clear. I mean, it's the situation of the fighting, it's the task, what we call task cohesion. So what is the role they have to fulfill, the task they have to fulfill. And of course, you could always debate what is more important. So some colleagues argue that the task cohesion is very important. It has to be a just war. Also the political system is important, more important than just the situation of the fighting. And of course it's very difficult to decide what is more important. We would all agree to the system of horizontal cohesion, vertical cohesion, of different impact factors, the primary groups, the tasks, and also the situation of the fighting. But then it depends on the individual scholar. What do you think is more important? And I would not neglect task cohesion. I would think that, for example, the Wehrmacht was very successful in telling the soldiers, you are in a just war. And they were also very important in telling the soldiers, we as a Wehrmacht are a competent institution. It's worth fighting for us. And they were very successful, even more successful than the Imperial Army, you could possibly say. But still, and this is the difference to today, that possibly the Bundeswehr is not as successful as the Wehrmacht in doing that. And also some German soldiers don't understand what they were doing in Afghanistan, and so there's different political systems. So this is discontinuities, but the continuities is, I think, definitely on the impact factor of the situation of the fighting. And I would think that the fighting has a massive impact, and that this is really important. This is somehow, to a degree, really a melting pot of identities. And you could see how soldiers from different social backgrounds behave in a very, very same way in a battle. But this is still a debate, and we will see how much my colleagues are going to follow me in my book.
I actually have a follow-up question now.
Yes, please.
So the difference between the Bundeswehr and Wehrmacht to a certain degree is also in the Bundeswehr there's more of a problem general with, or in the German public, with war and fighting a war. So there's you could say, a bit of a contradiction between democratic and war. And if you look at the United States armed forces, are they better in integrating that? Because the United States has a different attitude generally to the armed forces, or quite a very different attitude to the armed forces than like currently in Germany. Are they better in adapting to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the United States is much better in constructing a vertical cohesion, what I call vertical cohesion. So a cohesion of soldiers with their military and political leadership, and by the political leadership with the society. So I think it's still important for soldiers of how are we recognized by the society, by our fellow citizens, by the politicians, and by the military high command. And at least from a European side, I would say that in America, there's a very high respect for the individual soldiers on all levels, military leadership, politicians, and the society. And there's a reason for that, obviously, that America has won a lot of wars. There was no fighting on its own soil in the 20th century, only in the Civil War, etc., etc., etc. The German experience, I mean, Germany has a different history, as we all know, and of course the conclusion after the two world wars, especially the Second World War and the Holocaust, etc., must have been, very negative, and that obviously for the German side, war did not bring anything good, but mass murder, a lot of killed and dead people, a destroyed country, and a separate country in two halves. So therefore the German society was always very skeptical towards the military. To a degree you could say even too skeptical, because the major problem in German history was not, I think, the military, but the politicians. So Hitler was not a general, but a politician. And the First World War, if you go back to the First World War, the jump into the dark in July 1914 was not done and ordered by the generals, but by the German Chancellor, Bethmann-Hollweg. So I see really the politicians as the major problem in German history. But the perception in the German society was different. Perception was, it's the military is bad. And there was some reason for that, of course, if you look at atrocities and these things. So, and therefore, it was always a bit of a contradiction of the Federal Republic of Germany having an army and armed forces. And there was always a bit of a tension between, should we have, we should have an armed forces because, there's a threat from the Warsaw Pact countries. But couldn't we phrase that a bit more civilized and a bit more civilian? And there was even a big debate, should we think the armed forces from the perspective of war or from the perspective of peace? So, hundreds of years, armed forces were always looked or approached from the perspective of war. They should think about wars, should plan, prepare wars, and should fight wars. In the Federal Republic of Germany, it was different because, the scenario would have been a nuclear war, which would have destroyed all of Germany, at least that. And of course, you can't wage a war anymore with nukes in the Cold War. So therefore, this idea was, the war is not really for the fighting, the armed forces are not really for the fighting, but for peace. And you should not train as hard, and the whole habitus should be more civilian. And this was different to the United States because the United States always fought wars post-45, as in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, etc., etc., etc. And nobody in America would doubt, I think, that you have armed forces for deterrence, of course, but also to fight a war. And this attitude is very different in Germany, and therefore the tensions and the endless debates if German soldiers should really fight and go to war, go into combat operations, is endless and not ending. And therefore also the problems and the questions, what are armed forces for in Germany? And this is possibly really a very special case in Germany, possibly comparable to Austria and also to Switzerland. But I think it's very different even in Denmark or Netherlands or Italy. These are not warmongers, but they are very clear. If there is, a war against, ISIS, we're going to send combat troops. Whereas the Germans better just take photographs and let do the fighting. Let do the Danish and the French and the Americans, they can do the fighting, but not we.
I think it's not without irony that you pointed out that the political level or the politics is sometimes the problem. I think this is a real irony if you look at Clausewitz, who always talked about the primacy of politics, the Primat der Politik. And so exactly you could say in the end, we didn't understand Clausewitz, or we didn't implement him again, because this seems to be a common problem also sometimes mentioned with the total war discussion.
Yeah, I would definitely say that nobody in German parliament and politics reads Clausewitz, and I think my impression is that Clausewitz is read in America, in Britain, but not in Germany. So this is a different logic. So Germany as a country and as a political system is very uneasy with combat troops because of its historical experience. They have combat troops because NATO wanted them to have combat troops, and there's also a German rule, never alone. So if you as Germany want to be integrated in NATO, you must have combat troops because this is the ticket for the club. You must have combat troops, you must put them on the table. But the whole debate on strategy or grand strategy, there's even not a German translation for grand strategy. If you study at German universities, you would learn very little on strategy. If the Germans talk on war, they don't talk about strategy, they talk about atrocities. And if you study war at British universities, for example, you learn very little about atrocities, but a lot on strategy. And therefore, you learn possibly more on Clausewitz at British universities than in comparison to German ones.
Okay, I think we covered this topic fully. Thank you very much, Professor Neitzel.
Yeah, it's all included in the package.
Yeah. Also a big thank you to Tony and Flo from Real Time History for providing their logistical support with infrastructure and services. As always, thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.